All right, everybody. Welcome to this Saturday, I guess, late afternoon edition of my. Again, I need to come up with a new term for these. While they're not primarily educational office hours, but when they are instead covering unfolding disasters, as is the case at present. But for now, let's just call it a live stream, continuing coverage. Sounds a little bit too like a news network, but in any case, welcome back. There are the good news, if I can call it that, is that there is not currently any new fires that have broken out of any significance in the past day or so. However, I am not so sure that will continue to be the case. I have managed to jinx it during all of the evening office hours I've had this week, so I won't do that again. I do actually think that there probably will be additional fire starts. Hopefully no additional hugely destructive fires, but as I'll talk about in the session, the weather conditions upcoming look pretty bad, to be quite honest, from a fire weather perspective. In fact, actually worse even than I mentioned yesterday. So there is a new Santa Ana wind event occurring right now. It's not all that notable. It probably would barely make the news under typical circumstances, but given the fact that the two worst wildfires in LA County history are still simultaneously burning, and one of them it continues to expand into different parts of the Santa Monica Mountains and threaten different neighborhoods in the area bounded by the Pacific Ocean, Sunset Boulevard, the 405 freeway, and the 101 freeway, which is a pretty darn big box. There have been, of course, lots of rumors and fears circulating surrounding what might or might not put UCLA at risk, for example, in Westwood, that flagship university campus. I still don't think that there is a substantial threat to that campus. I still think it is highly unlikely that an evacuation would be ordered for campus, but again, can't rule it out. The fire is relatively close, and there are pretty adverse weather conditions coming. I do not still think this is the kind of fire or the kind of adverse weather conditions that would actually produce a genuine threat to campus, but again, these fires have surprised us before, and they may well surprise us again in some nasty and unpleasant ways, given that we do have multiple additional extreme fire weather events coming up in the next 7 to 10 days, with potentially another high-end one later this week. So the one right now, tonight into tomorrow morning, it's strong winds in the mountains and favored valleys, but not really elsewhere. This one will not extend down to the valley bottoms. A lot of people won't see much wind at all. The upper elevations of the Palisades fire, though, and the Eaton fires will see strong winds tonight out of the east-northeast, so that is a concern, but the winds will be largely pushing those fires back onto areas that have already burned. That's not exclusively true, especially on the Palisades fire. There are some fingers of fire that kind of extend farther to the north, so there is the potential that an easterly wind could push that fire back west, threaten new areas in Topanga Canyon, and then again down by Malibu if it made a really big run. I don't think it'll quite get that far, but it also could cause flare-ups on the eastern flank near the 405. Take a sip of tea here. So I was actually watching some of the live footage from ABC7 again that I've occasionally been sharing live during these live streams earlier today, and I frankly was pretty shocked to see some of the first clear aerial footage of the extent of the damage specifically on the Eaton fire in Altadena. I think that the structural loss estimates right now, which are, quote, in excess of 7,000, are still low. There is just such an unbelievable, literally almost unbelievable extent where city block after city block after city block, neighborhood after neighborhood was not just burned, but completely leveled. Clearly a high intensity fire. We're talking about uh, all the vegetation is gone. The trees are gone. Even some of the light lamp posts melted. I mean, this is really high-end stuff over a very large region, to the point that it really does. I don't love the analogy, it looks like a war zone, but in this case, it does actually look like that, because there is such a vast scope of devastation, and it's so total. You can have a total loss with a structure and still have a significant portion of it that didn't actually burn, because if some of it burns, the rest of it is probably irretrievably water and smoke damage. But what we're talking about are these city blocks that just, structures have burned to the ground, and there's just the foundations left. Thousands and thousands of them. At this point, it looks to me like the structural loss in that fire alone will probably be over 10,000. We know the combined structural loss totals now well over 10,000, probably 12, 13,000 as far as has been confirmed between the two fires, Palisades um, and the Eaton. But at this point, it looks like the Eaton will probably end up having the larger structure total. To me, it looks like it's going to be over 10,000, which is not to diminish the Palisades event in any way. That is confirmed to be over 5,000 structures, and I think that will probably grow further, at least a couple thousand more. That may end up under 10,000, but the fact we're talking about potentially on the order of 15 to 20,000 structures between these two fires lost is pretty staggering. And again, we saw that level of loss with the Camp Fire in Paradise in 2018. That was a single community, which made it especially intense loss. But here, a lot of the structures that burned were not just single family homes, but some of these are multi-story apartment buildings, commercial shopping centers, schools, public utilities, and banks, just about some fire stations. So just about any type of structure. It also means that the economically, the loss will be even more dramatic, not just because property values in the LA basin are generally higher than in Butte County, but because the kind of structures, one structure, isn't not one size fits all. A structure could be anything from a mobile home to a multi-story apartment complex. And so it also has probably affected a lot more people, because there are a lot of structures that burn that were probably home to multiple families as well. So this really is a shockingly extensive devastation, and we still haven't even gotten clear pictures of the full extent of the Palisades fire, which is one reason why these damage estimates remain preliminary and uncertain, but probably biased low. So when they say that at least 7,000 on the Eaton and at least 5,000 on the Palisades, that means those are the ones where they're quite certain. There are also going to be additional structures that did not burn to the ground, but are still total losses, because they've either experienced extreme smoke or water damage as a result of firefighting efforts or broken water mains, or because these structures will have been opened and abandoned. It will be weeks to months before some of these areas are accessible to the broader, not even the public, but even residents in the area. So the losses are going to be staggering financially, and in terms of the housing stock and the public infrastructure in these regions. The water systems will have to be rebuilt, electrical systems will have to be rebuilt. The scope of the damage removal is going to be huge, as we've seen in recent fires. But the full story is still untold. There are still structures that are burning today, burning anew on the Palisades fire. The rate of structural loss has greatly decreased. We're not losing hundreds or thousands of structures per day as we were in the first 2 days of this fire, but 3 structures here, 5 structures there, that adds up too. And this is sort of chipping away at the periphery in western Santa Monica and Brentwood and over into Topanga Canyon, places like that. So as folks have been following, I have been struggling. This has been a particularly bad week to have both a more ordinary upper respiratory infection or a cold, plus a big flare of my autoinflammatory disorder. Some folks were asking earlier, I don't mind, it's Yao syndrome. I actually have to go see Dr. Yao this week. Anyway, I'm trying my best to balance recovery from that, plus continuing to engage with what is a genuinely historic and devastating pair, not just one, but two individually devastating wildfire disasters. In terms of loss of life on these fires, the death toll does continue to climb. It's confirmed to be between about 10 and 15 between the two fires now, and will probably rise further according to reports. I still think it's a small miracle that it wasn't in the high dozens or even in the hundreds, given what transpired. The death toll probably will rise beyond where it currently is, but I'm reasonably hopeful it won't rise to the triple digits. And as much as I wish I could give really good news about the weather, I do not have that news to convey. In fact, I have pretty bad news about the weather. The short term, we're having another Santa Ana event, as I mentioned, tonight into tomorrow. It isn't that strong, although it could still cause problems. We'll see another one, though, early in the week, and then another one beyond that, and toward midweek, that could actually... and I hesitate to say this, it could rival the strength of the original extreme wind event that drove these two urban conflagrations into populated areas. It does not look like the San Fernando Valley would see winds as strong, because it doesn't look like there'll be a mountain wave component with this one to transfer all of those very strong winds aloft all the way down to the surface. But right now, the models are trending significantly stronger again with this midweek event, and that could be a big problem because there's no indication of any precipitation before that point or during that event. It will be a colder event, and this will be noticeable. This week it's still relatively warm, high around 70 in LA, which under normal conditions would be pleasant, but is eerie at the moment in mid-January as these fires continue to burn. Later this week, though, these are going to be cold Santa Anas, it looks like. And that could actually pose its own set of problems for firefighters out on the fire lines and all of the people who are currently newly unhoused or don't have electricity, which still includes about 100,000 households that don't have power, even though the winds are long gone. And one other challenge is that the Eaton fire, the eastern fire in this pair of disasters, it doesn't have a lot of active fire activity right now, unlike the Palisades fire, which remains very active. You can see flames from all around the west side of LA and parts of the San Fernando Valley. The Eaton fire is much calmer right now, at least in terms of active flame, but the challenge with these kinds of weather conditions is it can flare back up. In fact, yesterday we saw a brief flare on the line fire, which started in September. It's not threatening anything meaningful right now, but this goes to show you that there are not firefighters putting wet line on every square inch of these fires, and that's not going to happen anytime in the near future. So some of these fire lines that are currently not visibly active still have some subterranean heat or smoldering stump or something, and they may flare back up during this event. Then, of course, the concern is that the Palisades fire just remains active, and so will flare up during any winds, potentially including tonight's. And then there's still the threat of any new fires that break out, and my fingers are crossed that we won't have those. But as the most recent comment reflects, it had a fire like the Sunset Fire, the one right above Hollywood, a couple of nights ago, broken out under stronger wind conditions. That could have become a third catastrophe in and of itself. So hopefully we don't have another fire like that under the wind conditions we're going to see once again later this week. Yes, as I mentioned when reflecting on a post in the Weather West comments section earlier today, I think that had the Sunset Fire broken out the night that the other two catastrophic ones did, when the winds were quite extreme, including in Hollywood, I really think there's a significant chance that it could have burned all the way to the famous parts of the Hollywood Strip. I mean, that's the level of destruction we've seen in Altadena in terms of how far the fire moved out of the mountains there. Had you superimposed a similar type of multi-mile progression from the wildland interface to urban areas, that would have probably gone all the way into the heart of Hollywood, which is kind of hard to fathom. But that's just how extreme those conditions were. On a brief programming note, I have been doing a lot of interviews. Yesterday, I actually ended up doing an interview for Anderson Cooper's program that I did not realize was going to be a 2-hour conversation, but I'm glad that we were able to do it. Now, the timing worked out because there's going to be a 1-hour special on CNN tomorrow night I think it's called LA Burning, but it's an Anderson Cooper hosted special. And I think I'm not involved in the production. I'm just a source. But I think a long segment of our conversations apparently will be included in that hour-long documentary special focused on the LA fires. And I haven't seen it yet, but I'll watch it to see how it goes. And I think a lot of folks who follow these live sessions will probably be interested. Part of the reason why I would like to watch it is that I have been so busy with dealing with some of the day-to-day and hour-by-hour developments and responding to folks, is that I haven't actually been able to see some of the footage that has emerged. Some of it, of course, I've seen, and it's pretty harrowing. But there we are. So that's tomorrow evening. I think you have to check and see what time it's on locally, but it's on CNN, and it should be, I think, an evening special that airs at different times and different time zones. Okay, so, but I really wanted to talk about, after reflecting on the fact that, the scope of the devastation from these fires is genuinely shocking, even as much as it's not necessarily surprising for those of us who study extreme weather and wildfire. But the part I really wanted to convey on tonight's session is that this isn't over yet. And I'm not sure that the biggest threat from these upcoming events will actually come from the currently burning fires. Hopefully, they'll be able to get the existing fires buttoned up pretty well before this wind event with the extreme amount of firefighting resources that are in place. I hope so. No guarantees, and I'm more concerned about the Palisades fire than the Eaton fire in that respect, although neither of them are going to be extinguished to the point where there won't be some concern. But I'm probably more concerned about the other fires that might break out in the region during the wind events later this week, partly because resources are drawn down, and partly because, some of those resources are exhausted human beings who are doing very hard work on the ground, and they're physically tired. I mean, imagine, under the current conditions, you don't get more effective the more exhausted you get, is what I'm saying. Additionally, there's some other concerns, and I wanted to raise this tonight too, because I have a somewhat substantial audience, and I think this is an important thing for people to hear. Do not fly a drone in the fire zones. It's very illegal, by the way, when there's a temporary flight restriction, like for a wildfire firefighting aircraft. It is illegal to fly a drone at all at any height in these locations, but particularly at a height where aircraft might fly. And remember that some firefighting aircraft or helicopters fly at very low elevations because they're either doing retardant or water drops, or they're doing reconnaissance, or sometimes even rescue missions. There have been a number of cases where the firefighting aircraft have been pulled off of fires, including as recently as today on the Palisades fire, because multiple people have been flying photographic drones in the fire area. And actually, the worst thing that's happened is that apparently by Pacific Palisades, one of the super scoopers actually hit a drone, and it created a hole in the wing on the aircraft. And so they made an emergency landing. They're fine. The pilots are fine. But now that plane is out of commission. There are not very many super scoopers available, and one of them is now out for the rest of the season, presumably, since they're going to have to repair that wing, and that doesn't happen quickly. So that hit a fairly large photographic drone, and there's a decent chance that someone is going to end up with federal criminal charges and massive civil penalties for that. So, there's the usual reason why you shouldn't do something, which is that it's a bad thing to do and harms other people, and there's negative societal externalities to flying a drone in a fire zone. But also on top of that, if they catch you, there's some very steep penalties for that, by the way. We do have an influx of firefighters and fire equipment from around, not just around the country, but all around North America. There's firefighters from British Columbia up in Canada who are headed down. Firefighters from Mexico have already landed at LAX. They flew in today. Even heard that locally in Colorado, the Boulder Fire Department has sent wildland firefighting apparatus and a crew. So it is certainly a collaborative, mutual effort across a wide range of states and even countries. I don't think we're probably going to see Australian or New Zealand firefighters, Southern Hemisphere firefighters this time around, because it is their peak fire season in the Southern Hemisphere. Of course, it is summer, so usually those crews are needed. But I think at this point, I think the crews that are needed are either there or en route, which just illustrates, I think, another point, which is that at a certain level of severity, additional personnel only gets you so much additional benefit, because you can only put so many people into harm's way. But I think one of the key benefits of having all these additional crews coming in is that you can allow crews who have been working very hard without a break for days to take a break. And so it's sort of in the relief shift mode. That's where I think a lot of the big benefit can come from, and in backfilling stations and facilities that are depleted because people are out on assignment on these active fires. A couple of folks have posted the timing of the Anderson Cooper special, so thank you for doing that. I believe it looks like it airs twice, 5 to 6 p.m. Pacific time and 8:30 to 9:30 Pacific time on Sunday. Okay, so let me share. I'm going to share my screen because I want to show some weather information. All right, well, first, here's the satellite image. Again, infrared, you can see. This is actually the weakest infrared signature that the Palisades fires had all day, so that's not the worst thing in the world. The Eaton fires over here, it doesn't really have a heat signature, as I mentioned, which is better than the alternative, certainly. The Palisades fire remains very active. It's very easy to see before the sunset where the smoke plume is, and air quality in LA, of course, has been pretty touch and go recently. Good time to bring out those air filters or your N95 masks if it gets really bad. Okay, but I want to jump to the weather, and here again, my go-to site is tropicaltidbits.com for all of this weather-related imagery. It's freely available. Does require some interpretation, but it is, again, a pretty amazing tool available for free. Okay, so this is our present time. I'm going to step forward in time. Obviously, this is the middle of the day Saturday. Moving forward, what we see with the current offshore wind event, so tonight into tomorrow morning, this is an inside slider low pressure system over the Great Basin. This is a more classic inside slider. It's kind of doing this, which is really just the classic. So you have a high pressure ridge. I'm going to keep these things on here. You have a high pressure ridge. You have a nice low pressure system. It's this, you have the jet stream kind of diving south like this. The pressure gradient sets up again in a classic way, so you have offshore flow. This is different than the event earlier this week where the low pressure system was all the way over here, which is what created the extreme winds. We don't have that tonight. We have a more classic, though still problematic, offshore wind event tonight. And then this system eventually, instead of moving fully to the east, it kind of just sits there over the Four Corners region, and then something else kind of weird happens. We're in the era of weird stuff. This ridge actually expands like this, so extending more over. Actually, let me zoom out a little bit to North America to better. So again, just to reorient people, since I just zoomed out a lot, this is California right here. So you'll see that. What we've got now is this ridge. It's got more of a tilted orientation. So instead of being oriented like this along the west coast, we now have this tilted, known as a blocking ridge. And what's going to happen is it's essentially it looks like this will end up being what's known as an omega block. Why is it called an omega block? Well, what does this sort of look like? It sort of looks like the Greek letter omega a little bit. You have a low pressure system here, a low there, and a high pressure system here. So with this pattern, one of the problems from a fire weather perspective is going to be that later this week, now we're getting into Monday, is instead of diving south over the Great Basin and moving east and giving us our classic offshore wind event, these systems are actually going to retrograde. Remember that term? Move back westward against the usual west to east direction. And this low pressure system is going to move right over California. Now, normally, if this was a bit deeper, it might mean some rain. But no, we that's too much to ask for, apparently, because now I'm stepping forward in time again. Instead of sitting closer to the coast, it's going to sit way offshore. So too far for it to really produce any meaningful chance of rain. There could be some clouds, so we might get some clouds, but it does not look like the system is going to produce any rain. And unfortunately, what it might do as it does this is it might produce a pretty severe offshore wind event when it's close to the coast here again. So right around, I believe this is going to be Tuesday. So the problem now is that we have a setup that's actually a little bit similar to what we had on Tuesday and Wednesday last week when we had these devastating fire events. And I'm going to zoom back in again so you can see this a little bit closer. But I'm going to switch over to temperatures for a moment. And what you can see now is that what we have, and actually I'm going to go to the different temperature metric. Not that one. Got to think about the best values here. Okay. Yes. So here's the problem. By the time we get to around Tuesday, we have this cold air mass across the interior, and that's going to allow essentially a strong wind event with, once again, pretty robust cold air advection, which really just means cold air blowing in above the surface, and that's going to allow some of these stronger winds to get pretty close to the surface. These are the winds higher in the atmosphere. This particular model depiction doesn't suggest quite as extreme of an offshore wind event as we saw last week. But the problem is this is a coarse resolution model, and they can't always resolve the spatial details that you would need to fully understand the magnitude of an upcoming offshore wind event. So we'll have to wait until we get a little bit closer. This is still 4 or 5 days out, so we'll know a little more within 3 days. But in general, this looks like it could be, once again, a rather powerful offshore wind event when it occurs and when this low pressure. It might affect slightly different areas, but in general, it looks like there could be multiple episodes of elevated to critical fire weather this week. And I'll switch back over to that original metric I was showing. Here's that low pressure system again. Let's go forward in time. So now this is Wednesday, Thursday. You see it's not really going anywhere. It's kind of just sticking around the California coast. We go into Friday, and then it kind of merges inland with a new low pressure system, inside slider, dropping down once again. As currently indicated, this would be another very strong, perhaps even stronger offshore wind event. This is next weekend. So now we're on number 3 from moving forward. The first one tonight, the other one early next week, then again by Saturday. Not great, to put it mildly. The only potential, very modest, and I'm not even sure this is going to happen, silver lining might be, and this is a depiction of what the current European model snapshot thinks could produce some rain. Well, there's a little bit, but it's way out over the ocean, so some scattered showers, not going to do much anywhere close to the coast. This low pressure system sits there off the coast all week and kind of falls apart as it moves inland, not really producing any precipitation at all. This particular model run suggests that there could be a chance of a few showers, a few light, maybe isolated showers next weekend in Southern California, but that's followed by what would then be a very extreme wind event that would more than evaporate the minimal water that could fall during that event. Let's take a look at a different model depiction of that similar sequence of events. The American model suggests the next weekend system will be more inland, so with no chance of rain, but also less of a chance of another offshore wind event. But let's see what it shows for the earlier week offshore wind event. And here it's pretty similar. You see that low pressure system diving southwestward, which is weird, but we understand why, much as the European model does, so this looks similar. Things dance around a little differently. Let's see if there's any precipitation being generated in these models. Again, only well offshore, so nothing over land. We get to Friday, still no rain. Still no rain. We're at January 20th, 9-10 days from now. Still no rain. Still no rain in Southern California. We go through essentially through the end of January, and this is a pretty bleak look, to be quite honest, right now. But to look 2 weeks out, it's more meaningful to use an ensemble rather than an individual deterministic model run. Those of you who follow me more for the meteorology on a regular basis know what I'm talking about, but essentially an ensemble is a distribution of different iterations of the very same underlying weather model that are run with slightly different initial conditions, because we don't know exactly what the initial state of the atmosphere is with 100% precision, so there's some uncertainty in that. And so to get an estimate of the range of possible future weather outcomes that are dictated by that uncertainty in your initial conditions, we run that model 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 times in a row. It's exactly the same underlying mathematical model, but with slightly different initial conditions, and sometimes it can result in quite different outcomes. So when we're talking about the weather 7, 10, 15 days in the future, it's usually better to use these aggregated statistics from the ensembles rather than relying randomly on one of those members from the ensemble. So that's what I'm doing now. So we look forward, we see that in general, the pattern looks pretty similar in the ensemble as it did in that individual deterministic run. We have this weirdo retrograding low off the coast, and we have this tilted high sort of ridge axis over the Pacific Northwest. So that much, as we go 3-4 days out, it looks pretty similar. And then it sort of moves inland on Friday. That looks similar. And then once again, unfortunately, the ensemble agrees with the individual models that this would be a pretty significant offshore wind event next weekend, without really much prospect for any rain. And unfortunately, this pattern with the ridge offshore going through the end of January continues to look favorable for offshore flow, inside sliders to dive southward like this and produce offshore pressure gradients that would drive repeated offshore wind events during this period. And what are the prospects for meaningful precipitation? Well, out through 7 days, 0 effectively, so we get through Saturday. Then there's that slight chance of some light precipitation in parts of Southern California next weekend, but it's very slight, and it's It would be pretty minimal even if it did. And really, we go out to 10 days, 12 days, there's really not much additional prospect on the radar. In fact, this is even drier than the January was looking yesterday. Again, all of the West Coast looking to remain much drier than average for the next 2 weeks. Pretty high confidence in that, in fact. So not just Southern California, but also Northern California and the Pacific Northwest. It's not as much of a problem in Northern California and the Pacific Northwest because it's been quite wet there so far this season. So this is far from a disaster there. But in Southern California, this is a big problem because it means that I don't see any obvious end to fire season heading into early February at this point. Excuse me. Just to clarify, since I know I faded out on that sentence, I don't see any obvious end to fire season really through the end of January or early February at this point. Okay, so I'm going to go back and take a look at the questions here. You're going to see my face once again as I bring that back up. All right, so take a look at the comments here. Thanks for joining, everybody. I do appreciate it. By the way, the channel surpassed 10,000 subscribers, I believe, today. So thank you for that. The circumstances are less than happy for that to be happening, of course. But I am glad that more folks have been able to get the information I'm trying to disseminate through this channel, and that this seems to be an effective platform for engaging with people and answering people's questions, and also serving as a de facto press conference. I know there's a lot of journalists who frequent these calls. Sometimes they ask questions, sometimes they pull footage and audio, which of course I strongly encourage. That is encouraged. I'm definitely not discouraging people from doing that. In fact, I think it's great. That's one of the reasons I do so many of these, because for every YouTube session that I do, there's probably 5 or 10 media interviews that I can check off the list. So that's in the name of efficiency. It's easier for me to say things once than 10 times. But of course, I'm still taking interviews as I'm able with individual journalists. For perspective, I think I've gotten about 200 to 300 requests per day each day this week. And so they're just continuing to come in continuously 24 hours a day. So I have an increasingly dire email auto response. If you email me at this point, there are some things I'm not going to be able to respond to for several weeks. That's just the nature of things at the moment. So thanks for your patience. By the way, I am hoping to have a blog post out on our Nature review on increasing hydroclimate whiplash globally. My hope is I can have some time to work on it tomorrow and potentially publish it early this week. That is my goal. I don't know if that's going to happen, so thanks for bearing with me. My live stream to discuss it will definitely be delayed past this week, but my goal still is to get the blog post out in the next few days. All right, so here's the questions. I'm going to take a sip of tea again as I read them. You're getting a pretty good sampling of my my wardrobe this week because I haven't had time to do new laundry, so I'm cycling through what's available. Yeah, there's a comment that the confirmation of 12,000 plus structures lost on the last AP report. That's total combined, so we'll see. But I think those numbers almost certainly will be above 15,000 cumulatively, and perhaps closer to 20, although we don't know. And there are still some structures being lost in the Palisades fire. Not a lot, but again, the numbers continue to tick up. And this is a good point. So rain at this point would be a blessing and a curse. I think how much rain, I mean, the ideal situation would be, a week straight of very light drizzle, right? Because that would be the most likely to bring fire risk reduction benefits without causing destructive flash flooding or debris flows. But it's actually something I'm extremely concerned about. I haven't ramped up the messaging yet because right now there's absolutely no rain on the horizon. So I guess it's a later problem for now. But at some point, likely still this winter, there will be probably at least one storm capable of bringing localized downpours. I feel like it's statistically safe to say. And when that happens, there's going to be grave concern over debris flows and flash flooding. The problem is the areas that have burned are, in some cases, rather steep, but also they're immediately above a lot of populated areas, including some populated areas that did not burn in the fires. And so that will be pretty high on the list of concerns next time there's a major rain event, will be the mudslide, debris flow, flash flood risk. Again, right now, there's no risk of that because there's simply no rain on the horizon. But once that happens, that's one of the additional problems of winter wildfires is because you can technically have a fire burning right up to the moment it starts pouring. And if that happens, it can get bad really quickly. So I'll talk more about that later because it's not an immediate risk. Do I see any renewed threat to the lower Santa Monica Canyon area from the current wind event? I mean, honestly, it's hard to say. There's not a lot of active fire there right now, and there's a lot of fire resources in the area. So I'd say like 70% probably not. But the problem is we know that these Santa Ana wind events love to rekindle even just barely smoldering chunks of vegetation or debris from someone's house who's burned. So it's certainly not impossible. So I'd say probably not, but that's not a highly confident probably not. I'm more confident that UCLA campus won't actually be directly threatened. Can I definitively say that it won't be or guarantee that there won't be a preemptive evacuation warning issued anyway? I cannot guarantee that, even though I think that if it were done, it would probably be out of an abundance of caution rather than due to an imminent life-threatening situation. I think that's extraordinarily unlikely for UCLA campus. From this fire, again, as I mentioned last night, if there ever were to be a fire that did emergently threaten UCLA campus, it would likely be a fire that was up in the hills in the Bel Air area during a strong north or east wind event. So will we have those conditions later this week? We might. But to be clear, there is currently no fire in that vicinity, and the Palisades fire would have to cross the 405 freeway and move in a way that it's not currently moving nor expected to for that to happen. So I'm not anticipating that to happen with this fire. But I know that it's a major disruption to UCLA campus. I know I did get the message that remote instruction has been instituted for next week now, I believe, as well. Students who live in dorms have been advised to have essentially go bags ready, which, again, I think is a reasonable precaution, even though I think it's highly unlikely that they would actually need to use them or evacuate in an emergent fashion. I actually think the greatest risk to campus, by the way, is probably from the smoke. There are going to be major air quality issues. There already have been. There will continue to be at times for the foreseeable future, and that is a real concern. Also, of course, there are students and staff and faculty who have lost their homes or have been evacuated, so that's another major consideration. And there's the stress and trauma of sort of being sandwiched in between two catastrophic wildfire disasters. I mean, UCLA is closer to one, of course, than the other, but it is essentially in between the Palisades fire, where thousands of people have lost their homes and some people have died, and the Eaton fire, where thousands of people have also lost their homes and additional people have died. So that's a big deal, and it's gonna be a real challenge. So, and there could be new fires this week. There could be new wind events, new smoke events. So I think it's going to be a continued tough period for a lot of people in Southern California. I wish I had some drizzle to report, but right now I do not. Mark mentions the winds have been up in the Bay Area today. Makes me nervous. Hopefully that is one nervousness that I can sort of mitigate a little bit by saying that it's even though not all of the Bay Area has seen a lot of rain this winter, the North Bay has seen tons of rain. There's no appreciable dangerous wildfire risk there. Period. The South Bay has seen less, but even here it has rained, and it's rained repeatedly, and there's been soaking rains, and the grass has greened up some. So the fire risk is probably not zero, but it's also not something I would be personally worried about, even when it's windy. At this point, which really just speaks to the importance of that seasonal onset of precipitation and that vegetation moisture. There's been all this hemming and hawing about how in Southern California it's only the winds that matter. So, the rain doesn't matter, drought doesn't matter, aridification of the landscape doesn't matter, which of course is just factually inaccurate, because the obvious, in science, one of the easiest ways to falsify something is to present an undeniable counterexample. And there's an easy one in this case. What if it had rained an inch or two last week, and then we had the exact same Santa Ana wind event a few days later? Would we have had these two wildfire catastrophes? No. I mean, that's pretty definitive. Obviously, it gets a little bit more complicated if the answer is, okay, but what if it had rained like half an inch 2 months ago? And the answer is less definitively no, but it is still probably, it wouldn't have been as bad as it was, and things would have developed differently. So, anyway, I'm not worried about fire risk in Northern California. I'm not worried about fire risk in the Bay Area. Does it mean there can't be vegetation fires? No, you probably, under low humidity and wind conditions, you could probably see, a grass fire or a low intensity brush fire. But would it be one that really is seriously life-threatening or property-threatening? Probably not. In fact, when it's not super windy, those are actually the kind of dryness conditions under which we often want to do prescribed burning, because you can't do it if it's too wet. You don't want to do it if it's super dry and windy either. But dry and windy, now when I say that, what I mean is vegetation being very dry. Sometimes it's actually good to do it when the humidity in the air is low, because you actually you have better control over your combustion. You have more complete combustion. And actually, incomplete combustion is very bad for the smoke production, because you get a lot of production of chemical species you don't want to be breathing in. So what you want with the prescribed fire is as complete of combustion of the stuff you're trying to burn as possible, so that it produces the least amount of toxic smoke. You want it to be controllable within the bounds that you want it to stay within, so you can't do it if it's extremely windy, and you also don't want to do it if it's extremely dry vegetation-wise, because sometimes then the fire gets a bit of a mind of its own if the vegetation is critically dry and can evade control even if it's not windy. So there is this Goldilocks situation. We've published a paper on this last year, how it is literally a maximization and minimization challenge. If you're a programmer or a mathematician, essentially you're trying to maximize certain variables and minimize others, and in that in-between zone is your Goldilocks zone, where it's most reasonable and safest to perform prescribed fire. And the safest time to perform prescribed fire is, or the most reasonable time, I guess is more accurate to say, is not when it's very wet, because you can't make much headway there. It has to be somewhat dry in order to do that. Sometimes you can even do it safely if it's quite dry, but not windy. It really depends on the context. So it is something I think we're going to have to get used to. In fact, we probably should expect to see more plumes of smoke in winter in Northern California, precisely for that reason. Not because we're going to be seeing catastrophic wildfires in the winter necessarily in Northern California, but because that may become one of the only reasonable and safe times of year to do that prescribed burning, because it is getting trickier to do it at other times of year. That's a whole other can of worms. We can have that conversation another day. But anyway, long story short, I'm not worried about fire risk in Northern California at this point, given how much water's fallen. Question from Jeff: is this wildfire event driven by weather whiplash phenomena? I would argue that it is a contributing factor for the following reason. Well, one, I guess the most basic thing, Southern California has experienced a hydroclimate whiplash event this year, from extremely wet to extremely dry conditions. Remember, last winter was very wet. But the reason the wet matters is that it resulted in abundant growth of grass and brush the past 2 years. In fact, in some cases, what is known as herbaceous fuel loading, so essentially the volume of biomass associated with grasses and light brush, was double the usual amount this year, and that's a direct response to how much water there was, how favorable growing conditions were. But then we had a long, hot, dry summer, some record-breaking heat in September, record-breaking heat across inland and mountain areas all summer, and then now we've had the driest start to the water year on record between October and early January. That sequence of events involves both adding more fuel, literally, to the potential fires to come, and then kiln drying it with an extraordinary period of unusual warmth and dryness that follows. That's why the order matters. That's why the whiplash matters in a way that is greater, if you will, than the sum of its parts. If we'd only had the wet conditions and this winter was kind of average, we wouldn't be seeing this right now because it wouldn't be dry enough to burn. But if we'd only had the really dry period, we would still be seeing an increase in risk right now, but probably we wouldn't be seeing extreme fire behavior to the same extent that we're seeing, because there'd be about half as much herbaceous biomass from last year to burn in those fires. So the intensity of combustion, of course, is a function of multiple factors, but chief among them is the actual available fuel, which in the case of a wildfire is the biomass of vegetation, and how dry it is, which is a function of the weather and the climate. So if you add more fuel to a fire and you dry it out more than usual, you're sort of accentuating the risk at both ends. There's a comment, a couple days ago I mentioned the, quote, European-style police siren that is an evacuation signal. I'd never heard of that before. Can you say more? At least in some parts of California, some law enforcement agencies have begun to use, and I think most of them have. I don't know if it's been used during this event, honestly. If anybody has heard these, you can tell me. But the two-tone sirens, instead of sort of an electric or a mechanical wail, like an ascending and a descending wail, just two separate tones. Think of like a fire truck in the UK or a police vehicle in France. Just the wee woo, the two-tone individual tone sirens are now available, have been installed on a number of law enforcement vehicles in California, and the goal is that they only use the two-tone as a signal that you're supposed to, if you hear it, you're supposed to, if you're close enough to hear a two-tone siren from a police vehicle in California, it's supposed to be a signal to leave the area, to evacuate. It's intended to be a clearer communication tool than an audio loudspeaker. Sometimes it's not obvious whether emergency vehicles are just trying to get into an area and are using sirens to clear traffic, or if they're using sirens to indicate an imminent threat and don't have time to go door to door. That is the intended use of the two-tone siren, although I haven't heard much about it this year, so I'm curious to see if anybody's actually encountered that. I know this is a thing among many law enforcement agencies in Northern California, including the Bay Area. Oh, there's an update. I can't verify this independently, but that would be good news if true. There's a comment that the super scooper that was damaged by the drone might be repaired by Monday. Well, if that's the case, that's good news. Still, though, it's very bad that a firefighting aircraft actually hit a drone and was sufficiently damaged by it to ground the aircraft. There is a real risk, by the way, that in such situations, a drone strike could actually cause an aircraft to crash. So this is not just a cosmetic risk. In this case, that didn't happen, but that is something that could conceivably occur, especially with a plane that's flying very close to the ground. does not necessarily have a lot of room to maneuver or recover if needed. Okay. Let's see here. If ABC7 has been reporting that there's a 100% chance of rain, I honestly am at a loss as to where that's coming from. Full stop. Maybe on a different planet Earth. Okay, I wasn't seeing these comments as they came in. A bunch more just came in all at once, so I'm taking a look at them now. Let's see here. It's a question about what precautions can we take from the smoke. How long after an event like this does it take for the air quality to return to normal? Well, to the first point, one, recognizing that particulate pollution from wildfires is genuinely dangerous. It's not just a risk for people who have asthma, as was often said before, but it's actually a major risk for cardiovascular events. So heart attacks and strokes go way up when people are breathing wildfire smoke, so be careful. It's not a good time to go out on a beach run. It's not a good time to go on a bike ride necessarily. If it's smoky, you should, but the smoke will be in different parts of the LA basin bad at different times. It won't be bad everywhere all at once. So there's all sorts of public tools now. There's EPA Air Now is a good one. There's the Purple Air web map. So time your activities according to when it's not so bad where you happen to be. That's one option. And by the way, when it's bad, it's not always super obvious. If it's really bad, it's going to smell like a campfire. But sometimes it can be pretty bad without having much of a campfire smell from other pollutants. If you have to be out in it and it is bad, masks are helpful, although it has to be a fine particulate filtration mask. So this is a case where surgical masks don't really do anything. You would need something starting around the KN95 mask level. Better would be a true N95 mask with head straps. You can always go up from there. There's N99. There's a P100, I believe. That might be overkill or unrealistic for a lot of folks, but depending on what your need to be outside is and for how long and how bad it is, it might be worth the investment. But probably the most bang for your buck, what I use if I have to be out in wildfire smoke outdoors, is usually a head strap N95. Just make sure you're getting an authentic one, because there's a lot of fake ones floating around on Amazon and some of the other websites. Manufacturers usually have a code printed on each package that you can verify that it's authentic. Indoors, air filtration is great. HEPA or HEPA-like filters running continuously can bring a tremendous amount of smoke out. In fact, if you do this and you're interested, take a look at the filter after about a week of this, and you'll realize how effective they are, because they'll be black. So that's all stuff that you would have otherwise breathed in. So those are some specific actions you can do. In terms of how long it'll last as long as the fires do. It'll be episodic. It'll vary neighborhood by neighborhood, and sometimes the ash. So if you're in an immediate fire zone, like within a number of blocks from where buildings actually burned, some of the ash is quite toxic. So don't sweep it. Don't wear a mask if you're dealing with ash, even in the outside of the immediate fire zone. And it's better to vacuum it than it is to sweep. Certainly don't use a leaf blower. That's like deliberately aerosolizing toxic stuff. So don't do that. But better is to get it wet and scoop it up if you have to, or use a vacuum. There's a question about any thoughts on possible threats to the Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena. Well, from the threat would obviously be from the Eaton fire, which is relatively close. There was a threat, and had the fire started at a slightly different location, or had the wind direction been slightly different, I actually think that parts of JPL campus might well have been part of the firestorm. At this point, I think that risk is greatly diminished. There will be winds pushing any embers that can manage to pop up on the fire back towards JPL, but again, there's fire resources in place, and there's not a lot of active flame right now on that fire. So if that was going to happen, it was more likely to happen on Tuesday night. But I do think, it's, again, the odds are not zero, but I think they're quite low. Devin, I did not get clarity from YouTube on the claims against the account. It seems to be very difficult to reach people. I had a few people reach out on my behalf, and they got the brush off even internally, it sounds like. So I don't really know what to make of that. They pretty much said you're not supposed to use other people's live streams without creatively reusing it, which is exactly what I was asking them why what I do wasn't considered creative reuse. I haven't gotten an answer. For what it's worth, yesterday's live stream, where I also showed that, I did not get that message. So the only thing I did differently is I did not use the full screen version of the stream at any point. So perhaps that's a workaround. If so, that's acceptable. I'll be able to do that in the future. So it's what I'll do for now, unless anybody at YouTube is ever able to offer a real answer. So there are a number of reports of two-tone sirens. I'm seeing all the ones I'm seeing confirmed are from the Bay Area northward. So I'm not sure if this is maybe a Northern California thing, which would be a little bit weird. Maybe it is a Northern California thing. That would be an interesting question. If anybody gets an answer, you can come back perhaps in the next live session and mention it in the chat, and I'll answer it live if you can get the answer. Thanks for the kind words. I'm feeling a little bit better. I do, again, due to the underlying medical stuff, it takes longer than for a normal person to recover from even something like a cold. So it won't be too surprised if I still have some issues for a while. Luna the dog is not currently in the room. She does not actually like to be in the room when I'm speaking, so she doesn't like these live streams, even though her bed is in the corner of the home office. And by bed, I mean a requisition beanbag chair. And she did the requisitioning. LA County temporarily banned air blowers indefinitely. I'd be okay if that ban was permanent. There's a variety of reasons why that's the case, but that's certainly a good short-term intervention to prevent people from aerosolizing literally toxic chemicals in the wake of this. There's a comment from Dan, retired fire captain on ABC7, said that the main reason we don't do prescribed fires is a lot of NIMBYism, meaning not in my backyard-ism. What is your opinion on the lack of prescribed fire in the western U.S.? That's not wrong. That is one of the key reasons, as much as I hate to say it. People are afraid of fire. And I understand. I mean, just look at what happened this week. I understand that fear. And I think one of the challenges is that, there's a perception that all fire is bad and that all fires are like the big catastrophic ones. And it is true that you can have catastrophic fires. People die. Thousands of structures are burned. Lives are upended forever. We've literally seen that. But of course, there's a spectrum to fire, much like there's a spectrum to most things. And on the other end of the fire spectrum, away from catastrophic urban firestorm, which we've all seen too much of in the last 10 years, is the kind of fire that's actually beneficial, net beneficial to the landscape, necessary even for landscapes. So learning to live with fire does mean learning to embrace some kinds of fire. I don't think we need to learn to embrace firestorms in urban areas. That's never going to be a good thing. I think we can all agree that nobody wants an urban firestorm. There's no such thing as a good urban firestorm. But there is such thing as good fire, generally speaking, on the landscape and in the vegetation. And so part of that reckoning I think we're going to have if we really get a handle on some of these underlying problems is acknowledging that in a warming climate there's going to be more fire on the landscape, but that we have some choice about whether more of that increase in fire is on our own terms or whether and is in the form of just really dramatically scaling up prescribed burning, or whether it's essentially in the form of these increasingly catastrophic firestorms, as we've seen in recent years and now again this week, to just a sickening degree. So part of that is a communication effort to get people to understand fire, the necessity of fire, the inevitability of fire, and the spectrum of fire, from good fire to, we can call it bad fire for simplicity's sake in this discussion, but so it's not the only reason. There are real practical constraints, and frankly, as much as I hate to say it, in some of the places that burned this week in LA County, it would be really hard to do safe and effective prescribed burning, even if there was a lot of community support for it. So at scale across the western U.S., it could be a big part of the solution. I think we should do a lot more of it. In individual neighborhoods, your mileage may vary, and there's even some ecosystems that don't benefit as much from prescribed fire, and chaparral is actually a tricky one. It's much easier to justify prescribed fire in most grassland settings and in most forested settings than it is in chaparral-covered settings. And this is actually a point of contention among ecologists who study chaparral and some fire scientists, so I'm not going to claim expertise there. But it is less trivially obvious that more fire is good in chaparral systems than it is in grasslands and most of the western forests. So this is a tricky one. And even if it were desirable from a risk reduction perspective, ignoring the ecology for a moment, there is a real question sometimes about how you do it safely in a setting where there's so many homes nestled on winding mountain roads up to the top. I still think you could probably justify it given the alternative is what we've seen, where just it looked like a firebombing. I mean, the footage from Altadena and Pacific Palisades, and as we saw, with the Tubbs fire in Santa Rosa in 2017, and with the Camp Fire in 2018, the Marshall Fire in 2021, and the fire in Lahaina on Maui, I think it was last year, and in Portugal, and in Australia, and in Greece. So many places. It does actually look like a war zone. So that's the alternative. Then what's the cost benefit ratio of doing something that has some real risks, but controllable ones, and at least we get to engage in those risks on our own terms. That's life. It's a long cost benefit analysis, and you can overthink it, but ultimately, you do have to make choices, and you often don't get to make those choices in an ideal world. You got to make them in the world we live in, and that means that there's never zero risk to certain interventions that might, on average, result in desirable outcomes. That's a whole nother conversation. Interestingly, the comments that followed up are actually paralleling this conversation, so that's always nice to see. So there's some evidence, by the way, that the two-tone high-low sirens are being used in Southern California. It's mostly from news reports, but right around when the evacuation in the Hollywood Hills occurred earlier this week from the Sunset Fire, there's multiple people who said that they heard the high-low sirens then. So generally speaking, not all agencies might be using it, but generally speaking, if in California you hear it, that is what it is intended to convey. So perhaps not all agencies have access, but if they do, that is the intended use. Yeah, there's a comment about making a filter unit, a DIY high-level air filtration unit, sometimes called a Corsi-Rosenthal box. I have one. I rebuild it every year. I started doing that a few years ago amid the peak of the COVID pandemic, and I still have mine running, actually, since I'm not the only person in this household, and they currently have some sort of virus, so I'm running it for that reason at the moment. No smoke here, but it's good for, it's a good multitasker in that sense. Good indoor air quality. You can always improve it. The question about the photos on my wall, I can talk about those later. I'm trying to conserve my voice today, but if someone reminds me in a future session, I'll show the photos on screen. They're all photos that I took recently, so I can bring them up. I can do a photo session at some point when the stakes are a little bit lower. So further advice that some counties in Southern California have officially implemented the high-low siren setup for evacuation indications. Could goats be used? Ask multiple people in semi-urban environments. Sure, why not? I mean, goats will eat just about anything vegetation-wise. The problem is the kind of fuel that you're trying to clear in some of these places is not grass and small shrubs, but it's pretty mature chaparral. And if you have ever gone, if you've ever gone on a hike up above, up in the Santa Monica Mountains, that chaparral is pretty woody. So that's a bit of a different kind of problem. But sure, you can bring goats in on in really any lot that's got grass on it. The problem is we have millions of acres in the West, and even arguably millions of acres in California that desperately need prescribed fire treatments. So can you use goats across millions of acres? Probably not. Might it be an interesting intervention for the more highly populated or closer to urban areas? That's an interesting thing to think about. There's a comment from Cord Brooks, National Weather Service LA in their forecast discussion. So good on you for digging up the Weather Service forecast discussion. Says that next Tuesday's wind event will possibly rival the wind event last Tuesday, but without the mountain wave and winds in the San Gabriel Valley. What does that last clause mean? It means that mountain wave that I was talking about, where that the air sort of hugs the mountain on the way down, crashing down into the valley below, instead of getting this kind of effect with very strong winds, you get a much more shallow dive, and those winds won't make it all the way to the surface. So instead of getting those 70, 80, 90 mile an hour winds that fueled the firestorm in Altadena, those winds will probably remain up in the mountains and higher valleys. Still, to see winds of the same magnitude at upper elevations is not great, and there will still be windy at lower elevations. But what it means is it's unlikely that there'll be a damaging wind event at sea level or near within 1,000 feet of sea level in the San Gabriel Valley in the LA area. Still, though, it is not ideal to be seeing winds that could potentially rival last week. I mean, there's just no way to swing it. Would it be worse if there were an additional mountain wave pushing them all the way to the surface again? Yes, that would be worse. I mean, it doesn't look like that'll happen, but so there's a bunch of questions about the fire and UCLA. You should refer to earlier in the session if you want. These are always recorded, by the way, so you can always go back and take a look. But the short answer is all of the communications from UCLA, as far as, in my view, and so far as I understand them, are out of a high abundance of caution rather than due to any imminent threat, which makes sense because the fire is not rapidly moving eastward. We do not have any upcoming wind events that would be likely to push the fire rapidly eastward. The strong winds coming are going to be blowing the fire away from UCLA. The fire could still be active, backing against the wind toward UCLA, but it will not move quickly in that direction. That's also a type of fire behavior that's usually easier for firefighters and aircraft to approach to mitigate it, rather than being in the direction of the wind-driven spread. So I'm not that concerned. I would be very surprised if this fire made it to the east of the 405. Okay, I'm going to wrap things up. I should go have some soup. But my hope is that there isn't another major fire that pops up about 5 minutes after I end this live session, which is now what's happened 3 nights in a row. But there's a good chance I'll have a live session again tomorrow at some TBD time. I'm not announcing them very far in advance because I'm trying to at least be opportunistic with getting other things done. But we'll see about that tomorrow, TBD. And if I don't have one tomorrow, I will have one on Monday, for sure. Probably at least one on Monday. I might instead try and focus on getting this next blog post out, although honestly, now that I'm saying this out loud, if there's another major, really strong wind event coming this week, it might be better perhaps to update people on that instead. So in any case, I'll continue to be around in the coming days. I do have some travel upcoming later this week, so I will be on a plane on Thursday and Saturday, but I'll continue to follow. If things are really crazy, I might do an update on that trip. It's a short trip. But otherwise, between now and Wednesday, there will be a lot to talk about, so I will be updating folks continuously through then. Please do check out that CNN special tomorrow night that is hosted by Anderson Cooper, focused on the LA firestorms. And I'm just trying to quickly take a look at these last comments, see if there's anything else I'm going to answer before I wrap up. All right. Well, thanks, everybody. I'm going to sign off for the evening. Fingers crossed, I really am signing off for the evening. And then I will either talk to you tomorrow or, if not, then Monday. Stay safe and continue to not be the source for new unwanted ignitions. May you not be the source of unwanted ignitions. How's that for a benediction?